I think I will start. And I would like to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for what is a topic which I think we can all relate to in some ways. We all have had, most of us have had adolescents, that either our own children or children of our friends, and recognize that this is a very challenging time for young people wherever they are. As a follow-up to our October conference, we felt that this was a topic that we hadn't really addressed in depth, and it is such an important topic. And as we did in the October conference, we are looking particularly at adolescents that are coming from underserved and vulnerable communities. So it's a very specific demographic that we're looking at. But many of the things also relate to young people in our own communities as well. I'm very, very happy to have as our moderator our dear friend Frédérique Lambrakis-Haddad, who is a trauma therapist who has had over 20 years of experience working with young people in the UK and the US from very underserved communities around trauma. And she is acting as our moderator today, has been an active member of Giving Women, and we're delighted that she has taken on this role. So the ground rules are the same. Please put any questions that you have in the chat. We will be following it throughout the talk. If there are particular questions that are relevant to the discussion as it's going on, I will interrupt Fred and see if we can answer them, or they're part of that topic. You will be on mute during the discussion, but then we will unmute you all at the end for a question and answers. Okay, so thank you again so much. This is our last panel of 2022. I can't believe I'm saying this. It seems like we just started 2022 and we're now at the end of 2022. So we're really delighted to have so many of you with us. And we're going to start with a short video that has been given to us by UNICEF. Thank you so much. Just to set the scene. So Estelle, I pass it on to you.
My name is Renata Samuels. I am from Belize, and I'm an advocate for mental health for children and young people. Stigma and discrimination are quite real for everyone, I believe, that has a mental health issue. For me personally, when I first admitted that I have depression, the first thing people said was, but you're supposed to be a youth advocate, you're supposed to be always happy, you have things going, you always look like you're enjoying yourself, you don't have depression. The hardest thing I had to overcome was the idea of not being able to sometimes control my thoughts and how I really feel. Like I want to feel positive, I want to have an interest in things that really interest me. And then I realized how it's a real struggle and a fight. Self-care, I believe, is an effective coping mechanism to get through a day. For me, baking or cooking calms my mind, but you have to look at what works for you. And so I encourage all young people to take that time, that step, to sit down and decide, what do I need to do to get peace? What do I enjoy doing? For me, personally, it's very important to start off my day on a positive note. I use that one time to be my calm, to be my peace, to make sure I start off with a good positive step. I think coronavirus, COVID-19 hit everyone with just like a big smack in their face. No one was ready. I had to try to do video calls, I had to try to do messages, but it's that constant communication because we're virtual, we have technology, so it's not that hard to communicate with people. It's just being consistent because people need consistency, people need encouragement and support. We keep forgetting how important it is to just listen to the problems of people. Sometimes people just really need to tell you everything that's going on and you just listen right there. And that's one of the main things I try to do. It's worth investing in mental health services because your people are the foundation. People make up the society. Having teachers, parents, stakeholders, policymakers all understand what mental health is and not just hearing about it, but really learning about it is really going to help provide the proper support. So if you invest in your people, you can have a productive society.
So I now pass it on to Frédérique to take on this discussion. I've introduced her. And again, thank you so much to you and our wonderful panelists for being here today. So Fred, take it over. What I recommend is sometimes it's quite good to go on speaker mode, then and that can really focus on who's speaking.
Okay, thank you.
Don't forget to ask your questions. Thanks, Fred.
Thank you, Atalante. Well, thank you. And thank you, Joanna, for giving us that little video, because I thought that was quite relevant. And I'm hoping it'll come up sort of in a different way. And part of what Joanna and I were talking about was around the young person's voice. And that's part of the reason we decided to do that. Just very briefly, and I'll have you each introduce yourselves, because I think you'll probably do a better job of it than I will. So Joanna Lai, who is a health specialist and a program manager at UNICEF, is here today. And Giselle Dass, a child and adolescent psychologist and founder of CAFS in Sri Lanka. Welcome. And Anna Kidd, who is the director of the SHM Foundation, and it's a worldwide foundation. So perhaps what we'll do just to begin is have each one of you briefly just take a few minutes to describe your role, but also your work. And then we'll start around some of the topics we agreed to speak on. I will just add that part of this adolescent mental health is such a large topic. Part of the challenge was to sort of think about what would be doable and interesting and relevant in an hour and a half, because obviously it's a very, very large topic. So we'll try to do our best. And the focus will be around adolescent girls in particular. So Joanna, would you like to go ahead and start?
Sure, it's really great to be here and have this conversation with all of you. My name is Joanna and I work with UNICEF headquarters, the technical focal point in the health section for adolescent health, school health, and mental health. And the area of work, that we focus on in UNICEF, I'll speak more broadly about UNICEF because health section is just one of the sectors or the systems that we focus and integrate mental health work in. Our goal, I think mainly is to support countries, primarily low and middle income countries, but we also work with high income countries now as well, on an advocacy and policy front, on strengthening the capacity and the systems for child and adolescent mental health. That with a focus primarily on primary health care, so frontline primary health care, meaning the health services that are close to where people are. Primary health care schools as well is an important platform for us that we work with, and also digital platforms is another, in particular for reaching young people, an increasing place that we strengthen and delivery. And when we talk about mental health services, we really are looking at the spectrum from prevention and promotive care to looking at the risk and protective factors that impact mental health of young people, to community programs that can identify and support young people within their communities, and also supporting government health services from specialized care and care in general hospitals as well. So that's kind of a little bit about what we do and what our focus is.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Giselle, would you like to go ahead? Bearing in mind, we're hoping to see you the whole time, but if the sound goes, then we will understand that you'll just turn off your camera so that we can hear you better. But so far, so good.
So far, so good. Hi, thank you. It's an honor to be a part of this panel. So I'm Giselle, I'm a child and adolescent psychologist. And I'm the founder of CAPS. So CAPS ideally was developed because in Sri Lanka, there is so much of stigma with mental health in a lot of countries as well. But this limits people accessing mental health services. And therefore, we developed a concept to have a home away from home. So CAPS provides support for young people, adults, in a setting that is not a clinical hospital setting, because majority of the services that's provided in Sri Lanka is very medicalized. So apart from us providing services in our home, which is what we call our clinic, we also go out into the community and provide mental health awareness. We train doctors, we train community representatives in order to provide better support and mental health.
Thank you. Thank you, Giselle. We'll get into some of that stigma a little bit later. So thank you so much. And Anna.
Hi, my name's Anna Kidd, and yes, it's a real pleasure to be on this panel today, so thank you so much. I am the director of a charitable foundation based in the UK called the SHM Foundation. And I guess, yeah, I have two sort of hats on in some ways. So I'm a practitioner in myself, started sort of a peer-to-peer mobile phone support groups for adolescents living and affected by HIV over 10 years ago now. And we have a team in South Africa of young people who run those peer-to-peer support groups in Zimbabwe and Zambia. And we've also recently done some work in Sierra Leone. And then with my other hat on is I also run an initiative called Ember Mental Health. And Ember Mental Health helps support locally led grassroots mental health initiatives across the globe. And we developed this initiative because I think being practitioners ourselves, we realized how difficult it is to scale mental health initiatives or simply sustain mental health initiatives currently. And we really wanted to do something about that challenge and not just about our own challenge. And so we set up Ember now over 2.5 years ago, and we work with a group of different locally led grassroots mental health initiatives every year. And we've gathered, I guess, a lot of insights into some of these challenges. And we also work very closely with Giselle at CAPS.
Oh, thank you so much, Anna. And just before we sort of talk a little bit more about various topics, what I did really like about this panel is that sort of Joanna from the UNICEF perspective is a larger organization, sort of more macro. Giselle is more the micro, sort of on the ground. And Anna, you have a foot in each. So that's quite, I thought it was Atalante, you did your homework, and it's not by coincidence, I'm sure. So thank you. Okay, so starting perhaps with Giselle, in terms of challenges that you see in your work around adolescent girls in particular, bearing in mind the world that we're in is quite sort of gender fluid. So we are kind of bearing that in mind, but at the same time, we are also mindful that girls, particularly in underserved communities around the world, do tend to have slightly different challenges than maybe others of different genders. So Giselle, would you like to talk about some of the challenges you see in your work?
Yeah, sure. So like I mentioned earlier, because we work, so our clinic is based in Colombo, which is more the capital, and it's more urbanized sort of setting. So I will touch a little bit about problems we see within the Colombo sort of setting and also in the other parts of the island. So if we're taking more the urban sort of settings, we're seeing high rates of anxiety, high rates of depression, high rates of self-harm. those are most prominently visible, and also abuse in a sense of sexual abuse, boys sort of tempting girls to send videos, those sort of things is much in the urban sort of setting. But when we move a little bit to where I'm currently now as well, in the east part of the country and also in the northern part of the country, we are seeing high rates of self-harm, very high rates of suicide, depression. We're also seeing a significant increase in teenage pregnancies, which is something that's been brought up quite a lot. And we're noticing that this trend has started significantly recently, because I can remember a couple of years back when we were in the field, and these about 2 years, there was very much talks about suicide, but now we're seeing high rates of teenage pregnancies. We're seeing high rates of substance abuse, and most prominently drug usage, to the extent that it's going into the school settings as well. So, and this is both in the urban and in the rural settings. So that's currently what we are seeing a majority in girls in the country.
Okay. Thank you, Giselle. And so Anna, would you say these are similar themes? Are they the similar and others, or do you, where would your work sort of lead you to see the challenges?
Yeah, I mean that resonates a lot with what we're hearing as well. I guess some other things to bring to raise are, I think financial instability is something that we hear about quite a bit, and the pressure on mental health there. So, you know, pressure from households to earn an income from quite a young age. That's something that we hear about. Social media, and the pressure to achieve unrealistic goals. So when I was preparing for this panel, I spoke to some of the young girls that we work with in South Africa, and they were saying that often, you know, they go on social media, on Instagram, and there's these videos that make them feel like it's very, very easy, you know, to achieve a certain lifestyle, and you just need to do 1, 2, 3, and, you know, bingo. And that can be very difficult for people when things seem to not be working, and, you know, can cause, I think, quite a lot of anxiety. And I think, you know, the other challenge I would say as well is that it's great that many adolescent girls are now being able to be more vocal about their mental health. They have a language that they can use now to talk about their mental health. But when there is a real gap in services, in many of the countries that we're working in, this can feel very dangerous, I think, and very challenging, if there's nowhere to immediately refer them to. So yes, those are some of the things I was just thinking about in terms of challenges.
So Anna, in terms of the last point that you've just made, in terms of the raising of expectations, would you say that's partly because people are sort of talking about it a lot more and aware of it in a different way, and then aware of what they're not receiving, if that makes sense?
So raising of expectations in terms of lifestyle, is that what you mean?
Lifestyle, but also, you know, I'm aware, even sort of in the European world, so much TikTok and things like that, which on the one hand is normalizing mental health issues. So that's a positive, you know, things like autism and things like that, which were much more difficult labels. I think nowadays people are saying, yes, I'm neurodiverse, and, you know, that's a very positive thing. But at the same time, you know, if you're suddenly made aware of your needs and then there's nothing out there or very little access, then that can feel very difficult. Is that sort of what you're trying to?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're seeing. And I think just talking a bit what Giselle was saying about suicide rate. I mean, if I think about South Africa at the moment, it's a bit anecdotal, but I'm hearing a lot more suicide at the moment. And you know, when you speak to some of the young girls that we work with, they're saying, yeah, you're ready to say, you know, what you need to say, you're ready to try and get that support, and then there's nothing. And in some cases that is leading to, unfortunately and very sadly, more suicidal cases. So yeah, I think this is huge, this gap. And particularly when it's not, we're not thinking about how do we tailor those services to young girls and adolescents, and that is really quite worrying.
Okay, All right, thank you so much, Anna. And Joanna, you have sort of a little bit of a different perspective. You're looking sort of more world trends and things like that. What would you like to say about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two kind of pieces of information that I tend to look to when we're talking about what are the challenges that young people are facing in regards to emotional behavioral challenges, mental health challenges. One, we do have what the global burden of health estimates, which at a global level tells us it's about 13% of 10 to 19-year-olds globally who will experience a mental disorder. And, you know, for me, 13%, what that actually means is 86, we're talking about 80 million 10 to 14-year-olds and 86 million 15 to 19-year-olds who experience mental disorder during this period of life. And when we look at which disorders kind of are most prevalent, anxiety and depressive disorders, which we see as the most common, that's about 40% of what we're talking about. Then comes to conduct disorder, about 20%, you know, attention, challenges with attention, about 20%, developmental delays, and then, you know, the other remaining for the 10%. So when we look at both volume of people who need services and the type of intervention that's required, that's one way to see it. And then, you know, from our recent State of the World's Children report, I'm happy to share the link later. We also did kind of focus group discussions with young people in over 13 countries, high, low, middle income countries in different parts of the world. It was, you know, more than 1,000 young people that we talked to. And when we asked them from their perspective, you know, what are the emotional and behavioral challenges you face, and kind of looking into their words. One thing we saw, and this is part of our conversation, Fred, the other day, is that the way that young people describe the most important or significant emotional and behavioral challenges, when they talk about it, they don't necessarily use those clinical terms that we do. They talk about feelings of sadness, loneliness, shame, boredom, anger, hopelessness, defeat, I think, which just highlights to us that those diagnostic categories that are captured in the data I previously told you about, disorder or not disorder, it is important. I think it shows us part of the picture, but it doesn't show us the whole picture of what young people's experience with mental health are. And that while not crossing the threshold to just disorder, they might still experience high levels of distress. And one of the biggest things, I think everybody has mentioned it already, some of the factors, there is a high level of distress because they're living in distressed context across the world, whether that's actually, a lot of them talk about family, a family being, we know, being a very important protective factor, but a lot of the risk and the challenges they face are within family, among peers, at school. So I think all of these things that are both posing risk and protective factors, but these are the most immediate, you know, contexts where young people are living. Social media definitely has a big role. I think those issues of gender norms, the actual or perceived threat of violence, things like COVID. I think at all of these levels, there's definitely factors that impact mental health. And of course, availability of services and things like that as well, which in much of the world is still very behind in terms of actually being able to see a professional.
Yeah. Thank you, Joanna. I mean, this will segue very beautifully into our next section in a minute, but what you're making me think, and for us to hear, is, you know, sort of this 13%, which is 80 to 80 million, depending. People, I mean, that's a lot of people who are not necessarily accessing services globally. But in addition to that, there's this other very large, and who I guess who knows what the numbers are in terms of young people experiencing distress and not necessarily disorder, whether that's because they don't hit the criteria or they don't have the language, or you know, sort of, you know, it's also hard to assess. That's one area we'll be talking about in a minute, because everyone that I spoke to in preparation to this was talking about assessment, meaning is a very difficult thing to access as well. on the ground. But could you say, Joanna, just around this, because I thought it was very interesting, it makes me think around prevention and the lack of, in every country, and I'll throw in European countries as well as everywhere else, all different, the lack of prevention, which may then create sort of distress going into disorder potentially, or just high distress. High distress is, as we know from people that we've experienced in our lives or professionally, is very hard to cope with. And then if you're in addition in an underserved, more impoverished, or whether that be financial or in other ways area, it's going to feel very difficult to and then you're having social media showing you all the lovely lives that you're not having right now, which makes the stark contrast even worse. So could you elaborate a little bit around this mental health distress and not just disorder, Joanna?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way we see it is, of course, on varying levels of the challenges one faces in life, but that especially during adolescence, there are a lot of transitions, big transitions, and difficult transitions adding on top. In the world that we have today, we all experience different stressors and things, and that causes some emotional difficulties in young people. But at the same time, and that's everybody, I think that's quite universal. So when we talk about prevention and promotion, we really see this as, these interventions are necessary for everybody, not just somebody who has a particular problem. And if we look at what we know kind of from evidence and from practice are the things that help young people overcome these difficult transitions, they're internal resources for coping. So skills for coping, having hope and aspiration for the future, expectations for the future, having strong caregiver support, having peer and social networks, being feeling connected at school, belonging at school. All of these things are just kind of basic ingredients of what's important. Even physical activity, we know, is important part of that. But yet today for adolescent age group, 80% don't have sufficient levels of physical activity. So all of these kind of changes in, I guess, modern society or the life we have today, we're just looking at having that right balance, that yes, we know people will face difficulties, but I think that kind of distress, emotional and other ways of coping happen when you don't have these, let's say, helpful ways of coping available to you. And so, to me, I think that distress, it's hard to quantify because at many moments, and it can come up and down depending on what point you're asking the questionnaire or the survey. But generally speaking, this is a time that we all know we've gone through too, that can face a lot of challenges. And for us, it's important not only to see the distress, but if you're feeling distress and yet you say, I actually have parents I can talk to, I have a school counselor, I have friends, then maybe we would be less concerned. But what we're seeing a lot of young people say to us again and again is like, I don't have anyone to talk to. I don't have anywhere to go to. Nobody understands. At least that's the feeling that they have. So that's, I think, the gap we're looking at, how we can work to close that. And also the skills in young people. So I agree with you. Prevention and promotion is really key because we won't be able to have enough services. As is, it's just not enough. There's no way that we're going to have enough health system service to meet this kind of a demand. So the investment really needs to be across, but proportionally in prevention promotion.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess, in a way, that's quite a lot to take in, but on the other hand, it may lead to opportunity sort of for lighter touch kind of interventions that can perhaps support some of that, but we can talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. Anna, would you like to say anything around this idea around mental health distress and not just disorder?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your final point around how there are solutions out there that could help support distress and We are seeing, lots of fascinating grassroots initiatives where if they were invested in and supported in more, they could really help on that particular piece. So I think there's hope there, and they exist. So
can you give us an example of one that you may have heard of, or you can remember, that of a grassroots that may have helped a little bit?
Yeah, for instance, there's an initiative that we work with in Zimbabwe called Positive Connections. It's a group of young people who have developed an app where you can go on there and access all sorts of information to do with young people. And it's really written by them for young people. So, you've got information around nutrition there, you've got information on HIV, you've got information on things around your goals and future. They're very creative in the way that they develop these the content. So there's lots of, for instance, cartoons and things like that that are very accessible. So I think that's a really good example of one. And maybe, I don't know if you want to go on to that and later, but I think, a lot of these organizations are, they're voluntary led. And they have so much potential, but yet they need a bit of funding and support to help them to help more on that piece. Yeah.
Thank you. It makes me smile in that it's sort of, I'm in the UK, and it is very grassroots. But I'm mentioning this partly to show, in a way, how easy it is to make some of these changes if you need. I'm a co-founder of a charity, a local charity for young women, including non-binary, between 16 and 25, on mentoring. And it is grant-based, but it's a small budget because it is volunteer-led. And we basically set up young women with mentors in the community. They're all volunteers. And the budget we have to do with coffees and teas and drinks when they're out. But it's sort of trying to find that gap, that one person they meet fortnightly. And the other thing we do is it's around self-care, which made me think of the young person that we heard about at the beginning, from Belize. She was sharing how self-care has been a very, very significant sort of change in her life, and sort of through baking and cooking and also journaling. But these, none of these are rocket science, but if she hadn't been helped with that, then, and perhaps supported, and, this sort of booklet, it's very basic, but, it sort of gets the young person to kind of go through and figure out what their self-care is. And that's a workshop that I do for free in schools and universities. So it's nothing that's sort of terribly original, perhaps, but it's that light touch kind of thing that's very community led, I guess, and not huge costs. So thank you for that. Giselle, would you like to add some thoughts as to on the ground in Sri Lanka? What your thoughts around this?
I mean, actually going on some of the stuff that Joanna mentioned, distress and disorder, in our clinical setting, we're actually seeing a very high rate of young people coming in, not necessarily with a disorder, but more with this distress element, right? The coping skills, not having anybody to talk to. They can't talk to parents. They can't talk to friends. They don't have any support from school settings. And we're seeing a very, very high rate of that now in our clinical setting. And also, funnily enough, like we were running some workshops today with key stakeholders in the community up in the East. And these were people, so we had midwives who were there from the health sector, we had school counselors who were there, and we had people from sort of government officials who were there from our district sector, young people are facing. And one of the key things, and again, going back to what Joanna was saying, they were talking about the coping skills, that they feel young people lack coping skills. And they were trying to figure out, at what stage or what level do we start introducing this? And I mean, the midwives were talking about, you know what, we talk to young women, we talk to them before they get married, we talk to them before they get pregnant about family planning. We talk to them about when you have children, how do you cope? Because I mean, a mother plays a significant role in the communities here in children's lives. So they're doing trainings there. So like, what more can we do from the health sector? And then we go to the school sector, and the school sector is talking about, well, we're running workshops, we're running sort of trainings, we're trying to catch children young, we're trying to train them on coping skills. But I think in the community, what we came back is, understanding that they don't really know what they're missing out, because they understand there's a gap. They're trying everything that they can do, but they're talking about coping skills. Where are we missing this? How are we going to be able to equip them even more, do much more than what we're already doing when they're already really stretched in the community? So yeah, I think that's a very sort of significant thing that we're seeing here as well, not only in our clinical setting, but also in the communities that we go out to, this distress disorders and also coping skills.
Thank you. Thank you. And in terms of stigma, that's something that several of you mentioned. And Anna, you and I discussed this a little bit more, I guess. How would you say stigma impacts on access to mental health services for girls in particular?
So I think, stigma hasn't gone away, unfortunately, despite us talking about it more. And I think for adolescent girls, it can be incredibly difficult to access services because of stigma, but also because of their lives, and often very complex lives, perhaps very time poor. So we've seen that in the case of our mobile phone support groups in Zambia for HIV positive pregnant women, in that the only time that they really can communicate and have time to themselves and in a confidential space is late at night, around 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. And so you can already see that these kind of physical support groups are very challenging for many of these women to go in attend, because people start questioning, why are they leaving? What are they doing? And so that's why some of our mobile phone support groups have been working quite well for that group. But obviously, stigma really has an impact on their lives, in their quality of their life. There leads to anxiety and depression. And something that I guess also we see is that it kind of stops people from thinking about their future plans, their education, their career, when they're very isolated. As we all know, that has a very negative impact. And we've all, I guess, to a certain extent, experienced that a little bit with COVID, and how that impacts our mental health. So I think we've still got a long way to go when it comes to stigma.
Would you say, sort of the app is an example, but what have been some quite successful, I mean, the young person voice and the sort of, social media has lots of sides to it, some positive, some negative, but that was mentioned a little earlier, that can have a destigmatizing kind of impact in some respects. What in your experience has helped combat this stigma thus far, or where do you think it could?
I think peer-to-peer is really powerful for many young girls. Just being able to hear other girls who perhaps are going through that and similar situations. Obviously, it needs to be facilitated well with support, but I think there's a lot there, because I think they get empowered, they feel like they can take some positive steps in their lives. And so creating and finding ways to create those safe spaces for them, I think, is incredibly powerful and not very expensive, and is possible to do. I think that's probably what I would say on that.
Okay, thank you. Giselle, I was very captivated by your model, which is community-based. I would say that's reflected in Europe as well, in my experience, and in the US, I might add. where so much is still clinic-based and not genuinely community-based. And that will often stop people from using services for both stigma reasons and also access. If I'm perfectly honest, these clinics are not easily necessarily close by. Families may have difficulty getting there. You know, there's, in addition to the sort of mentals, and this idea that you have, it's almost a step further. I mean, being in a community is very well understood, I guess. Whether it's followed is a different story, but it is understood. But this home away from home concept, and the other one that you didn't mention thus far, but I'd like you to, is this model also that you've developed without hierarchy, for example. So could you talk a little bit more about this? Because I think what's very inspiring is the model you have come up with, and maybe we can think about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, the home away from home concept, again, we're seeing it really working well, again, with young people accessing services. Because Sri Lanka being such a small little island, one of the main reasons of why people don't like going into hospital settings to go see a mental health professional, because you've got this big board on, you know, the door of the mental health professional, and you're sitting there in the waiting room and you're bound to bump into somebody who knows you. So that makes people sort of shy away from accessing those services. And I think one of the things that we're hearing quite often is that when they come to our home away from home, they don't have to worry about bumping into people. It feels like you're going to meet a friend. It's less threatening. Also, parents find it less threatening to bring young people in because, again, with the clinical setting, there's a lot of blame that comes into play. There's a lot of, oh, you're a bad parent, you're a bad mom, or it was because of you that this happened. So we've got a lot of families coming in with that. Also, like a recent client that came in, a young girl who had attempted suicide. Her family was very much against taking her for support because, again, it was a very prominent parent and he just didn't want, the father didn't want anybody seeing. So it was not until the brother came down and found us and was like, no, let's go here. And even in the car, this girl was telling me that the dad was like, so are you going to tell what you actually did? And the brother turns to the father and goes, well, that's the whole purpose of this, right? Oh, no, but you can't. Talking to people about this. So, you know, that stigma is still there. But once he came into the setting, he felt a little bit more comfortable. He felt a little bit more at ease to actually sort of, you know, address and talk through what his, you know, daughter's problems were. So we're seeing people loosening up, people being a little bit more comfortable in our setting to actually come and get help. Just going with what you said also about, you know, the home away from home concept that we're resonating with our staff as well. And I think that's what really enriches the atmosphere in our clinic, because even our team, we function as a family. So we don't have any hierarchies. We don't have officers that, you know, the directors or whatever sit in. We're all seated in a, you know, in a common sort of area. We provide also opportunities for young professionals because we have such a lack in mental health professionals. And a lot of people, because they don't find any progression in Sri Lanka, move away. So we're having this brain drain as well. So with our home away from home concept, we're also trying to resonate it with young professionals who are coming into the field. So they don't feel that they don't have a standing. We're providing them a nurturing sort of setting where I always tell the young professionals who are coming in, I'll throw you into the deep end, but I won't throw you without a life vest. So I'll be there, I'll support you, we're all going to be there, but you need to develop and you need to be the future of the country because we're not having enough of mental health professionals to actually sort of support. Now that we're destigmatizing mental health, we need access. We need people who are able to support people who are coming for help. So that's very much our concept. I hope I wasn't breaking off because the power's also gone off a little bit.
Yeah, I think it was just about manageable. So can I just, before we move to Joanna, I'd like to hear Joanna's ideas and thoughts on this too, but could you just briefly describe what this home away from home is, so that I have a visual in my head, just to help people imagine.
So we've moved away from, like I said, the hospital clinical setting. So what we've done is we've taken an old house, which has a massive garden. So when you walk in, there is no reception. Like, we've had a lot of service users come in and ask us, do you live here? Is this your home? Because that's what it feels like. It feels like you're walking to somebody's living room. We've got a coffee and cookie center, so you can sort of make yourself feel at home while you're waiting for somebody. Each therapy room is decorated differently. So again, you just feel like you're walking to somebody's house. You're not really going in for therapy. It's also come to a point where our regular clients now know all of the other teams. So they walk in, they say hi to everybody in the team. They know where things are. They'll go around playing the garden for a little bit. We've put a little bench outside in the garden under coconut tree. So we see parents also coming with their books, sitting and reading while the kids are going in for therapy. So it's very much a colorful, vibrant, just feels like you're going into somebody's home to get support.
Thank you. Thank you. I personally can visualize it. I hope other people can as well. And so, Joanna, any thoughts around stigma and how it impacts in your observation and work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are commonalities around the world, and I definitely think there's cultural norms and religious beliefs and different things that also shape what that stigma and what those specific challenges are. But really at the heart of it, to me, is not having a accurate or strong understanding actually about what mental health is. When you say the word mental health, and Giselle will know, a lot of the names of the hospitals or the places, it's like the place where people who are insane go, the place where, you think psychiatric ward when you say mental health, but actually, that's not actually what it is. And I think there's just a lot of myths, a lot of misunderstanding about what, and that's where stigma will come from. To me, it's the opposite. If you think about it, is just acceptance of your own, what you're feeling, and being okay with that, and also accepting that other people may have days that they don't feel well. And I think that ranges too. Like, when we talk about it, we're not just talking about one thing. And I think that's still something. And I do see the challenge, because for all of us maybe, and for our parents' generation, there's definitely a big generation gap between the different generations and their perception and understanding of it, that we go into in a different way as well. And a lot of what we're talking about, coping skills, social emotional learning, self-care skills, those are things that young people can pick up quite much easier. It's the teachers and the parents that we're trying to teach them that actually have a harder time maybe grasping some of those things, because if we think about it, it is pretty difficult to give something that you haven't experienced. We haven't learned about it in the same way. The challenges are faced very differently. So I think these are all the things when we're talking about stigma to take into consideration. Gender, I think, gender is a big thing as well. We've talked about when it comes to stigma, that we see things, it's pretty common. It's okay for girls to cry, but not be angry. It's okay for boys to be angry, but not to cry. And how much of that will shape the way that they experience different symptoms, the way that people diagnose, the interventions that you offer. I think these all play a role. And so I think maybe your question was also about, what we can do with stigma. I think different campaigns, and there's different advocacy messages that we need to continue with. But I would say that it's very important to understand the perceptions and how people see things within different cultures, as a way for how we can kind of tackle the most challenging norms. And that's not an easy thing. But I will say that in most places, when you have you're struggling with something, telling it to your teacher, going to access services in school is like the last thing you'd want to do, because then you have something on your record that's going to affect you for life. Then people in the community are going to talk. So long as those things are still barriers. That is part of it. But I also think it's a barrier to the provision, that the lack of understanding of what the needs are and what mental health is impacts the way that providers, even, mental health providers, right, Giselle, the services and the way they go about providing services is impacted by, how they view mental health. So I think there's not one way to see mental health either. I think that's the thing. We all have to work across these different places and see, but I think acceptance is a big thing at the heart of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think Giselle's description of in the car with the father and the son and the young, that describes a little bit the generational gap you've been mentioning here, which is, I guess, quite prevalent, it sounds like, and still a barrier in terms of a lot of countries anyway. I'm mindful that we're going to be going around some kind of solutions and sort of also hindrances. But I'm wondering, Atalanti, are there any questions that have come up before we sort of move into that, or people have an opportunity?
There was one question around triggers, and I think we have talked about it in a kind of fairly general way, but I think maybe something more focused, if somebody would like to respond to that, maybe even, yeah. So around triggers, that was the one question. And the second question is, you talked around the issue of the father who didn't understand. How that's an important part also. How are we supporting parents? How are we supporting teachers? How are we supporting the community to be able to address and be open? And it's all about communication, I guess. Yeah. So those are the two.
So I guess I'll just open it to Anna, Giselle, and Joanna. Would anyone like to address around triggers a little bit more? I mean, Anna, you did mention around financial triggers, and also sort of around girls in particular, but also social media. Any other thoughts or any?
I think maybe, I don't know, Giselle maybe has more closer to the ground than I am on some of those other triggers, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things that you already mentioned also, Anna, in a sense of, social media, also there is the distress that we were talking about, right? Like you're not getting support because I guess some of the things could have been solved if we're identifying it at that sort of distress state. But what's happening is most of the time, either by parents, by teachers, by family members, we're missing it at that distress sort of state. And I think that sort of then snowballs into larger, much more complicated issues. So if I was going to add anything more, I would say us not picking it in a timely sort of sense. And it could be for any conditions. I mean, again, if we're looking at learning difficulties and learning issues, we're getting young adults now coming in who are struggling with their life because it was missed when they were much younger. Things like ADHD, things like just a learning issue, right? Like dyslexia, things that could be picked up, but they weren't really sort of picked up at that point and supported. And that's snowballing into much more complicated issues now, like snowballing into depression, it's snowballing into anxiety. So I mean, if I was going to sort of add another trigger from what we've already spoken about, I would also say the fact that we're not picking it up, and the environment that young people are sort of, being exposed to and being supported in. That's one that I would add.
Yeah, I would completely agree with what you're saying. And also, you mentioned, and as did many of you, sort of the increase in suicide. And, that would be sort of one of the, when you don't catch things early enough, intervene in a more preventive way, then things do develop. And then it is literally too late in some cases. So it's really quite heartbreaking.
And I think it leads into really the issue around how do you work with the parents, the communities actually to to recognize those, because it's interrelated, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think Giselle was, quite, so one of the things is around sort of literally getting into the community and destigmatizing the actual care that was mentioned. Anna's talking about co-creating things, the young people sort of co-creating, the apps, Joanna, sort of around the people's voices. So this report, which, on this recent study, I guess you've done around 13 countries, was it, Joanna? Around young people's voices and really hearing directly from them. Does that also, Joanna, go with messages that they're a bit like the video you showed us at the beginning? Are those voices then linked into any action with those voices, if that makes sense?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, and this links to your question about, I guess, when you're saying triggers, it's, what are the greatest risks? What are from their perception? And there are many, I think, but if we try to in some way organize and think about it at the family level, if they're talking to us, and they brought this one up a lot, I will say among all the different things, they spoke a lot about family, and that's to do with in financial instability within the family, that's to do with parental pressure that they feel. I would say these are all triggers to the point. I mean, I think there's also abuse and neglect within the home, difficulties in communication, or the lack of support and invalidation they receive about different things. These really were big triggers in terms of the challenges they faced. And I think on the other hand of it, what it points to us and why, this information is so critical for us is then the intervention. And I think, Adelanti, you've brought that up a lot, is if we keep talking about services or schools, but yet young people are telling us, at home or with my caregiver, that's where a lot of my challenge is. If our intervention doesn't also reach the caregiver level, we're missing the point in some ways, right? And so, and that's not just to say, I think someone else had mentioned this, it's not to say, it's parents' fault, parents are bad, it's caregivers need support. Because we also talk to caregivers, and they are also, and all of us who are caregivers can know parenting today, or, there's a lot of stress faced within that. And so, we can speak a little bit about that later. UNICEF, has a lot of focus now as well on caring for the caregiver support, intervention, both for caregivers of early, first-time parents or in early childhood, but definitely in adolescence as well. I think peer violence online and at school is a very big thing that young people talk about. And of course, there are, across different contexts, some differences. Gender norms are huge, and we're talking about not just, I think, gender norm in that it affects the life choices of girls at this particular age. Their reproductive health choices, child marriage, if they stay in school or not. These are really big big things that impact their mental well-being. Same for boys, pressure, I think, sexual orientation, gender identity today. These are all things. And then at the very macro level, I think with COVID pandemic, financial crisis, like climate change, there's so many things that can cause this, jointly cause this distressed environment that a lot of people are living in, which elevates. I think we can all relate to that, not just young people. It's just that young people are particularly also going through life transition that intensifies this, and the way that their brain is growing, the way that their social role is, their body's growing. I think it intensifies the same feeling. Maybe some of us who have full cognition also feel stressed about. Yeah.
That's really
true. There's a couple of very interesting questions. One from Victoria Paget. I've heard that awareness raising of certain self-harm practices can sometimes backfire and increase the number of people engaging in them. Have you found this to be true? And if so, how is this mitigated? Don't know for whom this.
Who would like to tackle that? Giselle, do you have any experiences in that?
Just when I was reading the question as well, what's interesting is, again, at the workshop today, some of the school teachers were bringing this up and they were asking us. And then we had this doctor stroll in and say, just don't talk about anything, because if you talk about it, you're going to make them do it. So just ignore it and just carry on. And this was right after we were talking to them about the fact that, you know, there is talk that if you actually start talking about you know, suicide or self-harm, that you would increase the person of following through with it. But there is also research that talks about the fact that actually it's the opposite, because you're opening doors for people to talk about something, for people to actually express, because that is coming from a place of distress. And I think the problem that we are seeing here is, again, just like that example of the father in the car, you're hushing up everything. You're not giving an outlet. And I mean, if I'm going back to that girl, when she actually sat there, she was like, I don't know what I'm feeling, because I'm told to forget about it. It's supposed to be not a big deal. The health professional who spoke to me in the hospital, I overheard her tell my mom that, oh, I'm just being an adolescent, it'll pass, it's not a big deal. But I don't know if it's right for me to feel that there is something that's just not okay. And I know I don't want to hurt myself. I know I don't want to feel the pain, but I also worry that if I had access to something that was less painful, I'll actually follow it through. And I think those words itself is a strong indication of, I guess, an answer to that question, right? Like, yes, we need to navigate through it carefully, but also it's not something that we just shut our doors and not talk about, because you might be opening an opportunity for somebody who's having significant distress, because now she's just denying what she's feeling. She's like, maybe I'm just making this up. Maybe I'm just not feeling anything, because everybody else around me is saying I shouldn't be, and I'm just acting up. I don't know if that was a, you know, roundabout way of answering the question.
No,
but.
I think that's a beautiful way, personally, to answer the question. I also think a little bit of what you said is resonated in that first video, where the young woman was expected to smile and sort of, you know, but she was trying to make sense of how she felt as well, and clearly was actively trying to do something about it. I would say that points to the generational gap, and I think, you know, we'll address this in a minute, but around social media, I think as well, which is, you know, this youth in this world right now are being exposed to a lot more information and a lot more talking out. And I think this is a very hard thing for older generations to understand. And maybe many of them have had to absorb and just, but then don't realize the intergenerational trauma that they are passing down unconsciously, and certainly not on purpose. They're not trying to show it, but it's that level of passing it down without wanting to, perhaps, and certainly and certainly on an unconscious basis, and they're not seeing the effects of that, and it, you know, that because they're not trying to do it, and so I think that's part of what's being that struggle between how much information and you know, and certainly I would mimic even in my work in terms of, you know, self-harm is an indication of distress. You know, yes, some people may be viewed as more attention seeking versus others, but if you're in a good place, are you actually going to be doing this to express yourself? Unlikely. And so yeah, it needs to be looked at any which way rather than shut down. Okay. I know you have a couple other questions, Atalante, and then we're going to be looking around hindrances and access and funding and things like that.
So we have from Sophie, and it really leads into also Dunya's comment and question. I believe that schools have a role to play in preventing mental health issues. Adolescence is essentially a chaotic metamorphosis of mind and body. But if we can teach them coping skills ahead of that time so that they go in that journey with strong tools and awareness of those feelings, for instance, in Australia, for example, some primary schools would have an hour of mindfulness. Do you see some local initiatives of that kind in schools? And then following that, Dunya goes on, sort of leading into that question around whether should be providing workshops for parents, and I think also teachers around mental health. So those are kind of linked. Those are the two.
Yeah. Who would like to have a word on that?
I'm happy to, because I think this is an area of work that we very much strengthen, are focused strongly on, and UNICEF is working with countries and education systems, both Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education, on this capacity building of, school nurse, school counselor, teachers, peer leaders. School is a very critical place, and it's a place where kids spend a lot of time. Also, of course, I think there's a lot of people out of school, so we have to think about both contexts. But I think something like an hour a week of mindfulness, definitely it can range from things like that. I think definitely this is where the local adaptation and working with local stakeholders and young people matters in how we shape these. It could be so many things. I think building the skills is very important. I think we've all talked about that, having the internal coping resources, but at the same time, I really like that you brought in teachers and parents, because it's all those levels. You want to build the skill of the young person, but the environment around them has to also change. If I live in a very stressful environment, experience a lot of difficult things, even if I boost my coping skills, if that doesn't change, what do you expect the young person to change eventually, right? So I think we want to put emphasis on all of those layers. You want to be able to cope with academic pressure, but in some countries, do we also want to think about not having that high level of academic pressure that kids feel the need to study from 7 a.m. to midnight, which is actually the case in some places. In another place, rural village somewhere else, the stressor that girls face is that by 15, 16, I'm expected to marry. So the skill is the same, learning to cope with different things, saying what you want, but the stressor is not always the same. And I think one thing we saw across the focus group discussions too is that young people had a hard time talking about like what they like to do, for what they like to enjoy doing. There's less and less. Online seems to be the outlet. Less time, less space for meeting with people. And I think COVID obviously impacted that, but for different reasons. In some countries, I couldn't play sport and do things I enjoy because I have to study. I don't have time. In other places, I didn't have money to afford buying the shoes I need to be part of it. So the reasons can vary, but I think, yes, schools are very, and I just really quick to touch upon that point about, I think school is also a very important place to talk about and address suicidality. I think oftentimes people think that, talking about it will worsen the problem, but we really haven't seen that to be true in evidence and experience. It really hasn't. And in fact, there's oftentimes guilt and shame attached as emotions driving that kind of behavior and thought, not having other alternatives. Essentially, for me, that's the one, and suicidality is the fourth leading among the top 5 leading causes for death in this age group. So it is a prevalent problem, and it kind of is a reflection for us as a society and world today. If one of the leading reasons why young people choose to end their life is that they don't feel like there's another alternative, that they have to end their life, like what does that say about us as a society? That's
great choice.
Thank you, Joanna. I think the suicidal example is a very big one, and it points back to the preventive sort of stuff that Giselle in particular was talking about. I'm mindful that we only have 15 minutes left, and I just wanted to touch on two other things, just so we're mindful of what one is around other hindrances, access. I mean, many of you have talked around access being an issue. And then I guess ending on a positive way forward, sort of pragmatic solutions lessons that people in this audience can take away that can be applied to your work, but also perhaps in a different setting. So should we start with the hindrances or the barriers? Any ones that maybe haven't been mentioned? We've talked around stigma, but sort of access, the actual access. I think a few of you have talked about, well, Giselle certainly, in terms of the brain drain and professionals are sort of leaving. Would you like to mention that, and just any other access issues that you found?
Yeah, I think the brain drain, I think funding's a big one. And again, if you're linking to the brain drain, why is it happening? It's because still the government is not acknowledging the significant need of mental health professionals in the system. So we're still running a very medicalized model. In the Ministry of Health, there isn't a cadre for a psychologist. That's how bad our system is right now. There isn't a role for a clinical psychologist. It's only psychiatrists that's acknowledged. So that is and if the system changes, hopefully the brain drain will also reduce, because people don't see a future career. When I got trained in the UK, and when I made the decision to come back home, there was nothing. And I know a lot of my colleagues left because, I mean, we need to survive as well as much as we want to support the community. So if there is a system change, if, you know, the need for mental health professionals are acknowledged by sort of, you know, the governments, then I think that would really help. I think that's one of the major key problems that we're having, which again links to funding again, right? Because where's the money come? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anna, are there any other sort of, in your work, barriers, other access, funding?
Well, funding, surprise, surprise. Yeah, I mean, it's 0.5% of all philanthropic funding goes to mental health, which seems mad when you think about it. And I mean, I don't know the number in terms of how much are focusing on adolescent girls, but obviously that is even smaller. So, I mean, this is a sector that has historically been underfunded. And, you know, I think it's a huge topic and something that we really need to get our heads around. We've been doing a lot of thinking about what does the ecosystem need to look like for the work that we do, which is like supporting grassroots, locally led initiatives to flourish. And I think it's a lot about, it's not just about funding, but it's people coming on intellectually and sort of getting really stuck into, okay, like how do we create a flourishing ecosystem? And I think that's actually on the positive side of things. There's more people beginning to get into this sector. I think it used to be quite an intimidating space. You know, I don't have a background in mental health. And so when I first started working in this area, it was intimidating, was a bit scary, wasn't quite sure what I was qualified to do and what I was qualified not to do. And navigating that, I think, is perhaps sometimes there is a fear about sort of getting involved in this sector. So yeah, I think that's one area which is perhaps a barrier at the moment.
Can I just ask you, Anna, in light of what you just said, would you say, kind of echoing what Joanna was saying a little bit earlier, around one way around that lack of confidence perhaps is just genuinely going to grassroots and getting the communities to sort of lead the way, if that makes sense?
Exactly. And I think another thing we found when we started working in this area is that we felt that there were a lot of people saying, we've got to come up with the innovation, we've got to come up with the solutions, and we've just got to find, you know, the 5 solutions to all adolescent girls and roll it out. And of course, we know that it's so contextual and so specific. But then we was delighted to see how much innovation there is out there. And, we put this call out and no one knew about us, never heard about us. And we got a really good, submission of applications and fascinating things. And I think what we really try and look at is not about scale. We're looking at replicability. So we're looking, could this small, this model here in X community be replicated somewhere else in the world? Could someone learn from that? And, maybe it can really help on the piece that we were just talking about distress. Are there some very simple tools, methodologies that could be rolled out? So I think there's a lot of hope out there. It's I think, one, getting a bit more money invested, or a lot more money, ideally, but it's also just people trying to get over that fear or that barrier, perhaps, of getting involved in this area.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah, really good. Mm-hmm.
And Joanna, anything before we move on to sort of positive way forwards and pragmatic?
Yeah, I think actually what Anna and what Giselle said are all key. Funding, obviously, we know funding is investment is one of the things that's a challenge, but I think a lot of the times we're also talking about this figure, what healthcare spending is on mental health. And that's exactly to Anna's point. It's not just the health system, and the health sector has an important and big role to play, but it is not going to address most of that other stuff that we've been talking about. So we do need ministries of youth, sport, education, city planning, everybody to kind of contribute and think about what's my role in promoting and preventing, mental health problems or supporting people with mental health. Civil society groups, religious groups, I think everybody has an important role to play, and that we need to continue thinking that way, because what's required is going to be that kind of across different sectors, across different systems. And I think at the heart of it too, capacity building, even if you had the money, the systems and the capacity of, these governments and these systems need to be there. You might even have trained somebody and you place them there, but then nobody's coming for the services. There's a lot of things to consider. And I think, that's why there's not one kind of sector or profession that's going to be able to address these issues, and that it's the coming together, what you guys are talking about, that will be very important.
I guess that speaks to what you're talking as well, is the interrelatedness of mental health is connected to so many different aspects. And so that's both a strength, but it's also weakness when it comes to funding, because it's not on people's, it's not necessarily going to be on a sports top sort of level of budget, but yet it will be important. So that's a bit of a challenge. I guess education and sort of speaking to the people of the older generations also is really important as well. So in terms of the sort of last 10 minutes or so, positive way forward. I mean, Joanna, do you want to speak to that, as you're up there now anyway? Sort of pragmatic solutions, lessons, anything that you want to, maybe we haven't mentioned, that you'd like to impart before this is over? It's such a big subject. Yeah,
it is. I think, just ending on the note that we said, there is so much to be done in this area on so many levels, that I think everybody can find a solution and action and a way to contribute, even if that's, I always start with this, we have big level things like policy and capacity building and system strengthening, but, those things we know. I think improving data, improving like the information we know, but I would say definitely supporting caregivers is one that maybe we don't always think about as much, that we really need to support and work with caregivers. I think strengthening the approach within schools and improving our approach in schools is another one. It's very important. And then the last one is really working with young people, ensuring that they're engaged. We might think, let's deliver all the services in school, and they keep telling us, like, did you ask us? We don't really want to receive them in school. We really have to work with them to see and take their perspectives into consideration. So I would kind of say that if we could do those, I think it would help a lot within the current approach of what we're already doing. But since it's all women here too, our own experiences, our own thoughts in terms of how to support girls better. We're talking pregnant adolescent girls, girls who are married, and all sorts of different situations. I think that will also be very critical. So,
and with this idea that you initially mentioned around mental health distress and not just disorders,
yes,
or preventive promotion, sort of
prevention promotion. Yeah.
Okay. Anna, would you like to have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Joanna said a lot of what I was going to also say. Yeah, I think maybe this piece on co-designing solutions with young people is so important. And I think there are so many young people out there with ideas, and supporting them, I think, is so important. I guess I'd also say that there are very low-cost solutions out there that we could be investing in. So it's, I think that's an opportunity. And as I sort of said earlier, I think there's a lot that can be done if people want to contribute to thinking about what does that ecosystem need to look like for sort of flourishing mental health care support. And yeah, I think that's probably what I have to say on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and this is something you've just said, but Joanna as well, which is I'm a real believer in the power of one person, sort of, and even small actions. So yeah, I guess in that way, I'm hoping people will be inspired as well, not just overwhelmed by the hugeness, but actually in a way the distress, as opposed to disorder, might be somewhere where people can perhaps have an impact. And Giselle, would you like to have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, actually going with what you just said, like, just one person can make a difference. I think that's the approach that we at CAFS are taking, where we're focusing a lot on building relationships, because I mentioned about the problem that we're having in a sense of, the structures and from the ministries and all of that, right? So, but what do? Do we sit back and do we wait until we can change policies? Do we wait until, the ministries decide that this is an important area? So how we currently do, and thinking of one of the communities we went to as well, I remember the person in charge there said, we don't get support from the government and we wait for support from organizations like you. And I think that really hit home with what we were doing. So currently, the work that we're doing in our home away from home, that's one aspect, but also why we're reaching out to different communities is we're going into communities, we're trying to spend some time to understand what have they already developed, their current systems that they've developed, right? What are they using? Who are they talking to? Who are the professionals who are getting involved, or people who are just trying to help? And then us trying to see, okay, how can we support what you're already doing? How can we build sort of capacity there? What more support do you need? So currently here, while we're in the East Coast, that's exactly what we're doing. That's why we got key stakeholders involved as well to talk about what it is that we can do. And from that 3-hour workshop, what we came back away with today was the people from the education department were actually like, you know what, we really want to focus on some of this. Can you come and train us to run very basic screenings? We're not qualified. We have diploma level sort of mental health training. And we know we can't do what you as a clinical psychologist can do. But can you equip us with some basic ways of assessing so we can identify? Because one of the teachers were talking about how a child, going back to what I mentioned about we're missing things, a child who's gone to his ordinary level examination, the GCSEs, and failed, has asked a teacher, can I sue the school because you didn't pick up that I was having a problem before and now I'm failing here? And that's what's happening in our education system, right? And this teacher was talking about this and he's like, I can't argue with the student because he's right. We failed him, parents failed him because we didn't pick this up. So can you help us with something? We're like, yeah, organize it. We'll come and we'll train. And I think right now that's our way of moving forward with trying to sort of build capacities with what's already there in the community, and kind of seeing how we can support in that sense. Sorry, I know my internet's unstable again.
No, but we
Just
did
in
get
time.
yeah, just in time. Well, I'll leave Giselle's last note because that was a wonderful way of tying things up around the community and building on support on the strengths that already exist, linking a little bit to what Joanna and Anna were saying around grassroots and working with what exists. And Atalante, do you want to have the last word?
Yes, I would. I would like the last word. First of all, I'd like to say an enormous thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation, which has really brought out something that I think Giving Women actually stands for. And I think it's very much in alignment with Anna and the work that you're doing, is that there is so much to learn from the communities and the grassroots. And I think that more and more we need to listen to the young people and support the parents and support the teachers. There's a lot that I think really resonates with us. The other thing that I think was very powerful that Joanna said, and I think panels like this one really demonstrate how powerful it is the exchange of knowledge. So I liked very much what Anna was saying, replication, but it's not even replication necessarily. It's what are the things that work and how can we move them with some adjustments into another context. And I think that we need to be talking in these kind of fora more and more, because that's when that exchange really happens. So I would like to extend an enormous thank you to Anna, to Gisela, to Joanna, and to my dear friend Fred for a really vibrant and very enriching and granular conversation on a topic that is so vast, which you manage to really contain it and do something extremely meaningful in this discussion. And I think for me, what we talked about today is, you all said, I believe in the power of one. And this was one of the real mantras of Giving Women when we set it up. Every one of us can make a difference. It doesn't matter who we are. It doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter how much money we have. But I think, as my daughter Eliana said, we believe in the power of one, but the magic of many. And I think we've seen this here today, yet again. So thank you so much, everybody. And we wish you all the best for the end of the year, and hope that you will have some great festivities to celebrate the end of the year. And we look forward to seeing you all in the new year. So thank you, everybody, and keep well and safe.